The cabin lights glowed softly and calmly. But behind that calmness, hatred was waiting to strike. A young black mother cradled her baby, whispering comfort, when suddenly, a hand cut through the air and across her face. The world froze, passengers stunned. To the crew, she was powerless. To them, her pain didn't matter. But they had no idea the truth they had just awakened. A truth that. The day began quietly, the kind of morning where the world seemed to pause between night and the rush of daily life. Maya stood at the window of her home, watching the pale gold of sunrise slip across the horizon. In her arms, her baby stirred, stretching tiny fingers toward the light as if trying to hold the morning itself. She smiled, pressing her cheek against the softness of his head, inhaling the sweet, powdery scent that always reminded her of why she fought so hard to keep her spirit unbroken. Life had not been easy, but Maya believed in building beauty out of struggle. Every photograph lining the living room walls told a story of resilience. Her graduation picture, where her smile masked the exhaustion of working nights while studying. The small but joyous wedding ceremony where friends and family gathered to celebrate love despite whispered doubts. And now, the latest, a framed newborn photo of her son, his face so peaceful it almost looked painted. These were reminders that obstacles did not define her life, but by victories, both quiet and bold. Her husband, David, had left early, his suit sharp, his briefcase tucked under his arm, his mind already on the responsibilities waiting for him. To the outside world, he looked like any other professional man headed to work. Few knew the reach of his influence, the empire he quietly commanded, or the vast responsibility resting on his shoulders. But to Maya, he wasn't a businessman, a leader, or a symbol of success. He was her partner, the man who steadied her when she wavered, who whispered faith into her ears when doubt threatened to drown her. Maya never carried herself with the pride of wealth or the arrogance of privilege. She lived in simplicity, valuing peace more than power. Her days were full of small, intimate rituals, singing softly to her son while folding laundry, rocking him to sleep by the window while the hum of the city faded into the night, writing in her journal whenever thoughts pressed too heavily on her chest. She found her strength not in how the world saw her, but in how she chose to see the world. Yet beneath the gentleness of her days, there was always an undertow. Being a black mother meant that the world often met her with suspicion before kindness, with prejudice before patience. She had grown used to the sharp stares in department stores, the subtle distance people created in elevators, the impatient sighs when her baby cried in public spaces. These were not loud acts of hatred, but quiet cuts that accumulated, leaving scars invisible but deep. Still, she rose above them. For her son, for herself, she carried dignity like a shield. She refused to let their judgment bend her posture or steal her smile. Every morning, she reminded herself, I will not let them decide my worth. That particular morning carried a sense of purpose. Maya was preparing for a flight, a journey that promised not just movement through the skies, but a step toward new beginnings. She packed carefully, folding tiny clothes into the diaper bag, checking bottles and blankets, slipping in a worn paperback book she knew she probably wouldn't get to read but carried anyway. She wanted the trip to be smooth, uneventful, a chance to breathe between responsibilities. Her baby cooed as she dressed him, the sound bright and innocent. She chose her own clothes with comfort in mind. A soft blouse, a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, shoes easy to slip on and off. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply a mother traveling with her child, carrying love as her most visible luggage. The drive to the airport was calm, the city still waking. She watched the streets pass by, the morning light bouncing off buildings, the hum of traffic growing steady. Inside the car, she felt the familiar knot of anxiety that travel always brought her. Not the fear of flying, but the fear of eyes. She knew too well the way people scanned her from head to toe, the unspoken questions hanging in their stares. Does she belong here? Can she afford this? At the airport, those fears met her quickly. At the check-in counter, the staff member's smile was polite, but her tone carried the edge of impatience. At security, the guard rummaged through her bag a little too long, pulling out bottles and toys with the suspicion of someone expecting to find what wasn't there. In the waiting lounge, when she sat with her baby, the woman next to her shifted slightly, pulling her handbag closer as if danger sat wrapped in a baby blanket. These were not accidents. These were patterns. Patterns Maya had learned to recognize, to swallow, to survive. She reminded herself to breathe, to keep her focus on her baby's soft breaths, his tiny fingers curling around hers. She whispered to him a quiet promise. You will grow up in a world where you are more than the judgments they place on you. You will not carry their prejudice as your burden. Boarding was announced, and with it came a flicker of relief. Soon she would be seated, and soon the most challenging part would be behind her. She wheeled her stroller down the jet bridge, her baby's eyes wide as they caught the bright overhead lights and the distant hum of engines. The closer she came to the aircraft door, the sharper her unease grew, though she couldn't yet explain why. The interior of the plane smelled of clean leather and manufactured calm. The crew stood in their crisp uniforms, their smiles thin, practiced. One attendant glanced at her. Not the warm, welcoming glance extended to the passenger ahead, but a cold, measuring look that lingered longer than necessary. Maya felt it pierce through her, heavy with judgment she hadn't earned. She whispered softly to her child, focusing on the rise and fall of his chest. All she wanted was to reach her seat, to settle in, to disappear into the quiet rhythm of the flight. But the unease clung to her like static. It was there in the stiffness of the attendant's body as she passed. It was there in the way a couple ahead of her whispered and glanced back with raised eyebrows. It was there in the silence that followed her footsteps, as if the air itself was waiting. Maya told herself not to imagine things, not to let fear steal what could still be peace. But in the quiet corners of her heart, she knew. Prejudice had already found her seat on this flight. It was only a matter of time before it made itself. The aisle was narrow, packed with passengers fumbling with bags, pressing into rows, the air already thick with impatience. Maya carried her baby with practiced grace, one arm steady while the other held the folded stroller handed off at the aircraft door. She was used to juggling more than most, used to making herself small in spaces that weren't built to welcome her. She found her seat, adjusting carefully, tucking the blanket around her son's tiny body. His breathing steadied against her chest, soft and rhythmic, a comfort in the chaos of boarding. Maya inhaled deeply, trying to center herself in that small, sacred rhythm. For a moment, she believed she could make it through this journey in peace. But even before the plane left the ground, the weight of eyes settled on her. Across the aisle, a man leaned slightly in his seat, gaze fixed on her as though she were out of place. Ahead of her, a woman turned her head just enough to glance back, her lips tightening at the faint coo of the baby. Maya had seen these looks before. At grocery store checkouts when she pulled out her debit card, at boutiques where clerks hovered too close, at playgrounds where her presence seemed to unsettle parents who smiled too widely at others. She told herself she could handle this. She always had. But the air in the cabin felt different, charged, restless, as if prejudice was waiting for its cue. The click of heels drew her eyes up. A flight attendant moved briskly down the aisle, posture stiff, smile painted on. To one passenger, she offered a cheerful, "Welcome aboard." To another, a bright laugh. But when her gaze landed on Maya, the warmth dissolved. "Ma'am," the attendant said sharply, though Maya hadn't spoken, "you'll need to keep that baby quiet during the flight. We cannot have disturbances." Maya froze. Her son hadn't even cried, only shifted softly in her arms. She nodded quickly, choosing silence, but the humiliation still pricked at her skin. The attendant didn't wait for a response. She pivoted on her heels and moved on, her tone suddenly sweet again as she greeted the man behind Maya. That was the first cut. The second came minutes later, when the baby whimpered, unsettled by the sudden dimming of the cabin lights. Maya rocked him gently, humming under her breath, her movements soft and practiced. But the sound seemed to ignite annoyance in those around her. The woman in front shifted with a loud sigh. A man across the aisle shook his head, muttering under his breath. Their irritation spread like ripples across the row, as if her child's small voice was more disruptive than the roar of engines outside. Maya's chest tightened. She wanted to disappear, to shield her child not just from the noise but from the glares. She whispered comfort, holding him closer, as though her body could absorb the weight of all their disapproval. The attendant returned, eyes scanning the cabin until they landed on Maya. This time, her voice carried for others to hear. "You'll need to handle your child better," she snapped. "We have rules for a reason." Heads turned. Passengers glanced, then quickly looked away. Maya's cheeks flushed with shame. She nodded again, her voice trembling as she whispered, "I'm trying." But the attendant had already spun away, heels striking the floor like a gavel. The shame didn't stop there. Water service passed her row without pause. Trash collection skipped her. Requests ignored. Each omission was a declaration. "You don't belong here." Her baby stirred again, a small cry escaping his lips. And then came the third cut, the one that split the cabin open. The attendant stormed down the aisle, face tight, voice raised. "Enough. If you can't control your child, you shouldn't be flying." Maya barely had time to react before the hand came down. The slap cracked through the cabin like thunder. Maya's head snapped to the side, the sting burning across her cheek. Her baby cried out, startled, his small body jolting against her arms. For a heartbeat, silence gripped the plane. Every passenger had seen it. Gasps broke the stillness, but no words followed. Maya's tears spilled instantly, not just from the pain, but from the humiliation, from the centuries of injustice packed into that one violent moment. She held her baby tighter, shielding him with her trembling arms, whispering shaky comforts he couldn't yet understand. The attendant didn't flinch. She smoothed her skirt, adjusted her collar, and walked away as though nothing had happened. The cabin erupted in whispers. "Did you see that?" She slapped her. Is that even allowed?" But no one rose. No one challenged. Their whispers floated like smoke, visible but powerless, dissolving into the air. Some passengers turned their heads to the window. Others busied themselves with phones, magazines, and seatbelts. Silence became complicity. Maya sat frozen, tears streaking her cheeks, her chest heaving with the effort of containing the storm inside her. The injustice pulsed in her veins, louder than the engines. She thought of every time she had swallowed words, every time she had endured quiet humiliations for the sake of survival. But this was something that could not be eaten. Still, she stayed silent, rocking her baby, because she knew any sound from her would be twisted against her. The plane lifted off, pressing her deeper into her seat. But instead of the usual relief of leaving the ground, she felt trapped, confined in a space where cruelty could stretch its hands unchecked. As the hours unfolded, the harassment didn't stop. The attendant's eyes found her again and again, narrowing with disdain. When Maya pressed the call button, it went unanswered. When she shifted her baby to nurse him under the cover of a blanket, the attendant sneered openly, muttering about inappropriate behavior loud enough for others to hear. Passengers reacted in fragments, tiny flashes of humanity swallowed by fear. An older man frowned, shaking his head at the attendant, but said nothing. A young woman in the back whispered to her companion, "This isn't right." Yet her voice never rose above a murmur. Even the ones who seemed to pity Maya quickly turned back to their own safety, their own comfort. Every minute stretched into an eternity of humiliation. Maya's mind drifted to the past, to other moments where prejudice had marked her life. The store clerk who followed her down every aisle pretending to tidy shelves. The job interview where her qualifications had been praised, but the position was suddenly filled. The hospital nurse who ignored her pain until her words cracked from begging, each memory layered over the present, deepening the wound. It wasn't just a slap. It was history replayed, violence sanctioned by silence, and yet even in her grief, a different flame ignited. She looked at her son's face, innocent, untouched, his eyes wide with trust. She whispered to him, her voice barely audible, "You will never believe this is normal. You will never bow to this." Her thoughts sharpened. They think I am powerless. They think I am small. They do not know who I am. They do not know who your father is, but they will. As the plane cut through the sky, prejudice sat bold and unashamed in the aisle. But so did resistance, waiting quietly, steadily, like a storm gathering strength behind calm clouds. The slap was not the end. It was only the beginning of a reckoning none of them saw coming. The engines roared beneath the belly of the plane, steady and unrelenting. But inside the cabin, the air was thick with an entirely different hum: guilt, shame, silence. It pressed against the walls of the fuselage like a second atmosphere, suffocating and heavy. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, stealing glances at Maya, then glancing away, as if their gaze might implicate them. Maya sat with her cheeks still burning, her son nestled against her chest. Her fingers traced slow circles across his back, soothing him, but inside her own body a storm brewed, dark, wild, and unstoppable. Her lips quivered from the effort of staying silent, of swallowing the scream that clawed its way up her throat. Her mind replayed the moment again and again, the slap, the gasps, the eyes that refused to intervene. She felt the sting not only on her skin but in her bones, in the marrow of every memory where she had been told to shrink, to be grateful, to survive quietly. But this time was different, because she was not who they believed she was. The attendant swept past again, her presence sharp and suffocating. She paused at Maya's row, glaring down as if expecting submission. "If you can't control yourself," she hissed, "I'll have you removed when we land. Don't make this worse for yourself." Something inside Maya cracked. She inhaled deeply, her tears drying into a different fire. She looked up, not pleadingly this time, but with a gaze that cut sharper than glass. "You've already made it worse," she whispered. Her voice steady now, her words calm but laced with steel. The attendant blinked, thrown off by the sudden composure. Her smirk faltered. She opened her mouth to retort, but the authority in Maya's eyes rooted her to the spot. For the first time, doubt flickered. Passengers noticed. Heads turned again, not out of pity this time, but curiosity. Something about the way Maya's posture shifted, the way her silence transformed into command. Maya straightened in her seat, adjusting her baby with practiced dignity. She pulled a sleek leather folder from her bag, one she had tucked away with quiet intention. She unzipped it slowly, deliberately, as though unveiling something sacred. The sound sliced through the hum of the engines, drawing attention like a drumbeat. Inside lay her credentials, documents embossed with seals of power, photographs that spoke of influence, signatures that carried weight in boardrooms and parliaments alike. She drew out one page, holding it with steady hands, and looked directly at the attendant. "You've forgotten who you're speaking to," she said softly, but the softness carried farther than a shout. "I am Maya Daniels, principal owner of this aircraft, founder of Daniels Global Holdings, and legal guardian of every soul inside this cabin when we are in the air." The attendant froze. Her eyes darted to the page, the official crest gleaming under the cabin light, then back to Maya's unwavering stare. The color drained from her face. A ripple spread through the passengers. Gasps this time were not of pity but of shock. Whispers rose. "She owns the plane? Wait, did she say founder? Daniels Global? That's her?" Recognition began to spark. A man in business class leaned forward, squinting, his voice low with awe. "She's on the cover of Forbes. I read about her last year. She's one of the youngest black billionaires in the world." The weight of realization struck the cabin like turbulence. People who had looked away in cowardice now leaned in with wide eyes, their shame intensifying. The attendant stammered, her lips fumbling for words. I didn't know. You didn't care," Maya interrupted, her voice calm but unyielding. "You looked at me, and all you saw was a black mother with a crying baby. You didn't see the woman who signs your paycheck. You didn't see the human being in front of you. And that is your crime." Her words carried like thunder, shaking every corner of the cabin. Passengers sat straighter, their faces pale, some nodding unconsciously, others looking down at their laps in shame. Maya rose slowly, careful not to wake her child, who had drifted back into soft sleep. Standing in the aisle, she seemed taller than the walls around her, her presence filling the narrow space with something far larger than herself. She held her son close, his small breath against her chest, grounding her as she spoke. "For years," she began, her voice ringing clear, "I have endured moments like this. Whispers, stares, dismissals. I told myself to stay quiet, to keep moving, because the world would not change overnight. But tonight, here above the clouds, I will not stay silent. Not when my child is in my arms. Not when the next generation is watching." Her eyes swept the cabin, meeting each gaze, pinning them to their seats. No one could look away now. You all saw what happened. You heard the slap. You saw my tears, and you chose silence. That silence is violence. It is complicity. It tells people like her, she pointed at the trembling attendant, that their cruelty has no consequence. The attendant's face flushed crimson. She opened her mouth, but Maya raised a hand, silencing her effortlessly. "But there are consequences," Maya continued, her voice rising like a tide. "When this plane lands, there will be reports filed, lawsuits pressed, careers ended. I will ensure it, because no woman, no mother, no child should endure what happened here tonight." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin, hesitant at first, then stronger. The young woman from the back called out, her voice quivering but firm. "She's right. We all saw it. We should have said something." An older man near the front spoke too, shame heavy in his tone. "I regret that I stayed silent. I should have stood up for you." Their confessions filled the air, voices that had once been whispers now swelling into something braver. Maya nodded slowly. "It is never too late to learn. But know this, silence is a choice. And tonight you chose wrong. Do not repeat it." Her words fell like a verdict. The attendant collapsed into a seat, her shoulders shaking, her authority crumbling in the face of truth. Maya sank back into her own seat, her child still safe in her arms. She kissed his forehead gently, whispering so only he could hear. "This world will know your worth before they ever question it. Because I will not allow otherwise." The rest of the flight moved in stunned quiet. Attendants tiptoed past her row, now overly cautious, offering water, blankets, and apologies. Passengers who had once looked through her now looked at her with reverence, their shame a silent penance. But Maya wasn't thinking of their guilt anymore. She was thinking of her son, of the legacy she was building, of the power she would wield not with wealth alone, but with truth and courage. For in the very moment they tried to break her, she had risen higher than the plane itself, above the clouds, above the prejudice, into a sky where her voice thundered louder than any engine, and nothing would ever silence her again. When the wheels touched down and the plane rolled onto the runway, the passengers exhaled as if the cabin itself had been holding its breath. But for Maya, the landing was not an end. It was the beginning of accountability. The attendant who had struck her now sat hunched and pale, wringing her hands until her knuckles turned white. Every trace of arrogance had drained away, replaced with dread. She knew what was waiting at the gate, consequences she had never imagined when she had raised her hand in thoughtless cruelty. As the seatbelt signs chimed off, the murmurs began again. This time, they weren't whispers of gossip, but words of solidarity. Passengers leaned toward Maya, some apologizing, others offering support. A businessman pressed his card into her hand, whispering, "If you need testimony, I'll stand for you." A young student said, "I'm ashamed of myself, but I'll never stay silent again." Their voices no longer carried cowardice. They carried resolve. The door of the aircraft opened, and waiting beyond were security personnel, airline executives, and legal representatives, summoned long before the plane touched down. Word of the incident had already spread across radio waves and into the ears of the company's board. The slap of one attendant had become the shame of an entire airline. Maya walked down the aisle with her son still nestled against her, her posture unbroken, her dignity untouchable. Cameras flashed from the corner where airport staff had gathered. Some had recognized her instantly. The story was already alive, already burning its way through headlines before she even set foot on solid ground. And with each step, the weight of silence lifted, not just for her, but for countless others who had endured humiliation behind closed doors. In the days that followed, the storm grew. News anchors replayed the moment as passengers came forward, their voices trembling with the memory of what they had witnessed. "We saw it happen," one woman said. "She was slapped without cause. And she stood taller than anyone I've ever seen in my life." Social media exploded. Hashtags spread like wildfire. "Flying while black," "Stand with Maya," "Silence is violence." Millions shared their outrage, and millions more shared their own stories of discrimination in the skies, in stores, in schools, in offices. Maya's pain had become a mirror for the world, reflecting injustices too often hidden. The airline scrambled. Executives held press conferences with somber faces, issuing apologies that felt hollow against the depth of what had been revealed. The attendant was suspended immediately, her career in tatters. But Maya was not interested in apologies. She wanted change. Her lawyers drafted demands not for compensation, but for reform. She insisted on new policies, mandatory racial sensitivity training for all employees, independent oversight committees to review complaints, and public transparency of disciplinary actions. She would not let her humiliation vanish into the fog of corporate excuses. It would become the spark for transformation, and the airline had no choice but to agree. Because Maya Daniels was not just a victim, she was power embodied. She was influenced to sharpen her actions. And the world was watching, yet beyond the headlines, the actual resolution unfolded in quieter, more personal spaces. At home, in the soft light of her son's nursery, Maya rocked him to sleep with a heart both heavy and light. Heavy with the memory of the slap, the shame of silence from strangers. But light with the knowledge that she had risen above it, not for herself alone, but for him, for the future he would inherit. She whispered to him as his eyelids fluttered closed, "You will never doubt your worth. You will never bow your head to cruelty, because when they tried to break us, we showed them what strength looks like." Her husband stood in the doorway, watching, his eyes full of pride. He had built an empire beside her, but in that moment, he knew the truest legacy they would leave was not wealth. It was resilience. Weeks later, Maya returned to the skies. Passengers on her flights recognized her, sometimes hesitantly, sometimes with awe. They whispered her name like a prayer. Some approached shyly to thank her, tears in their eyes, telling her how her story had given them courage to confront their own wounds. And every time Maya would smile, steady and kind, and remind them, the real power lies in refusing to stay silent. The attendant who had slapped her faded into obscurity, her name buried under the weight of her own mistake. She became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how prejudice can destroy not only its victims, but its perpetrators, too. But Maya's name, Maya Daniels, grew louder, more assertive, not just as a businesswoman, not just as an owner of planes, but as a voice against racism in all its forms. She began to speak publicly, not in boardrooms, but in schools, communities, and churches. She told her story not for pity, but for awakening, and each time her words struck like lightning. Silence is violence. Speak even when your voice trembles. Stand even when your legs shake. Because change begins the moment we refuse to look away. For the passengers on that flight, life was never the same. The young woman who had spoken out that night found her own courage magnified. She became an activist on campus, rallying peers to confront injustice in their classrooms and dorms. The older man who had confessed his regret began volunteering with local organizations, determined never to stand idle again. Even the businessman who had handed Maya his card worked to implement new equity policies in his company. One slap had become a wave, a ripple turned into a tide, and yet the most actual impact was less visible. It lived in conversations whispered at dinner tables, in children asking their parents why someone would slap a mother for the color of her skin, in communities wrestling with truths they had long ignored. Because Maya's story was not just her own, it belonged to every person who had endured racism's sting. It belonged to every bystander who had stayed quiet and now vowed to speak. It belonged to a world still scarred, but still capable of healing. Years later, when her son was old enough to understand, Maya would tell him the story herself. She would not shield him from the ugliness because truth was the only path to freedom. She would tell him how she was struck, how she stood, how she revealed who she was. And then she would look into his eyes and say, "You come from people who do not bow. You come from resilience, from fire, from strength that no slap can erase." And he would know. He would carry it forward. As the story of that night faded from news cycles but remained etched in memory, Maya's final reflection crystallized into a truth that echoed far beyond her. Racism feeds on silence. Prejudice thrives in shadows. But when one voice dares to rise, steady, unbroken, unafraid, it can shake the walls of entire institutions. She had been slapped in an act of cruelty. But she had turned that moment into a revolution of dignity. And so the haunting question lingers for us all, a question passengers still carry, a question every viewer must face. When you witness injustice, will you stay silent? Or will you rise like Maya and let your voice become the storm that breaks the silence? A storm that breaks the silence.